Okay, hello everyone. Thank you very much for coming along this evening. My name is Godfray. I'm director of the Oxford Martin School, and it's a great pleasure to be talking to Nigel Shadbolt, Sir Nigel Shadbolt, this evening about his new book, relatively new book, As If. It's a double pleasure for me to be here, Nigel, because as you know, this was my old college, and this didn't exist when I left college. And of course, since I've left I've lost all my principles, so it's nice to get one of my principles back this evening. Nigel, before we talk about the book and AI and things, tell me a little bit about your history. You're one of the UK's foremost computer scientists, but you've monked around with philosophers quite a bit.
Monked around with philosophers. Yes, indeed. I took the kind of standard canon of A-levels at school, sciences and maths, and for various reasons, didn't end up going to university to take the kind of subject. I thought I might be a medic, but life intervened, road traffic accident, all sorts of things got in the way. And in the end, I was advised, and it was great advice, to go and read for a subject that really intrigued me. And philosophy and psychology just always had. And I suppose because my kind of intellectual preoccupation, I remember as a young boy, I had a telescope, Apollo era, Star Trek, Doctor Who. My life was full of aliens and robots, and so I kind of thought, what were the questions? Well, the questions were, was anybody looking out there back at me when I was looking through my telescope? Could you ever build anything like a robot? And of course, how was I even having these thoughts in the first place? And that bizarrely, those were the ideas rattling around in my head as quite a young man, reading all sorts of indifferent, good, bad, and indifferent science fiction and other work. So it seemed like philosophy and psychology was a great place to begin that inquiry. And I went to Newcastle University, and I fell in with a wonderful couple who were both professors, lecturers in philosophy at Newcastle, Mary and Jeff Midgley. And Mary Midgley, in particular, a renowned ethical philosopher. Geoffrey had worked in computing from the very earliest days, had been influenced and affected by the work that came out of Bletchley Park. And so it was a wonderful place to be. They ignited my inquiry for the philosophical questions around what it is to be aware, to be human in some sense, to be a moral agent. But the psychology on the other side was kind of, how do you make sense of that? And can we think of new ways of understanding our own cognitive abilities? And at the time, computing, AI was coming through. It was already a 30-year-old discipline when I got to it in the late 70s. It was a very natural progression from there to the Department of Artificial Intelligence in Edinburgh. It was a Department of Artificial Intelligence in 1978 to my PhD work. And we thought we were at the bleeding edge at that stage, of course, but looking back, the systems, the approach can look very pedestrian, but I still think the audacity of trying to use computers to understand ourselves and embody them with capabilities, it was exciting, both as an engineering project, but the philosophy was always in the background, those questions about how and why and if.
Well, perhaps building on that, we could talk a little bit about the sort of history of AI. And, well, to be a bit facetious, let's first talk about BCE, before ChatGPT. And you said that even when you were a young lad, there had been AI around for 30 years. And it sort of seemed to go up and down in enthusiasm. Can you say?
Somebody was saying, what was the first conversational agent I interacted with? And it was actually, in 1978, it was Joseph Weizenbaum's Eliza, which was a Rogerian psychotherapist. And you can have an interaction. The great thing about a Rogerian psychotherapist is that you basically, every time you kind of put your view to it, would say, well, now tell me why you think that. So it wasn't the most complicated, perhaps, conversational style, but it illustrates something quite powerful about the abilities of representing and perhaps reasoning with these machines. Weizenbaum himself was a critique of AI in general, but those early years, they were tremendously exciting. I mean, we had state-of-the-art computers. We had the very beginnings of the internet. It was the ARPANET, so we could connect from Edinburgh to MIT using satellite communications, logging onto their time-sharing computers. And we thought we had the most extraordinary software, and we were promising a world in which you could build natural language processing systems, simple robotic systems, vision systems. Actually, not everybody believed us. And at the time, Professor of Mathematics, Lucasian Professor of Mathematics, Sir James Lighthill, was busy trying to close down AI in the UK. He thought it was a frivolous and extravagant endeavor and didn't hold with it at all. Fortunately, he didn't take all of the funding away and didn't close down all of the departments, but it was a close-run thing. The thing that saved us was in the early 80s, the Japanese declared they were going to build the 5th-generation computers and they were going to revolutionize manufacturing, and everybody said, we can't have that, we'll lose all our jobs to Japan, the ascendant industrial power. And so in the UK, we began what was called the ALVI program, which put a huge amount of funding into the AI of the time, which involved hardware, software developments and evolutions. That ran well for a number of years, but then it all turned out to be much harder than we thought. You know, these investments that were made in building knowledge-based systems, they were delivered, implemented, used in all sorts of finance and medical and health contexts, but it was very hard yards to make them work in other contexts. And so there was a winter. And then there was a Reagan-Star Wars, which was to produce a whole set of new technology to combat perceived Soviet threat. A lot of AI funding at that time went in from the defense agenda, similarly in the UK, increasing interest in robotics, another flowering, another ingest of funding. Similarly, a period of, this is all harder than we thought and not as easy as we thought. And often you'd see this counter-cycling with developments in another field. So life science in particular will undergo periods of real attention and excitement, and next time round it would be computing again. So these cycles of enthusiasm are quite typical. And then in the 2000s we had the internet, the .NET boom, and everybody imagined that that amount of data at scale would release a new kind of capability. Working with colleagues like Tim Berners-Lee, we were excited by building this semantic web, as we called it, a world in which agents out on the web would do your bidding and book your flights and translate between languages. A very good vision it was too, and we're now starting to get there.
So, and then a few years back, ChatGPT came along and the large language models. And I remember having a conversation with you just after I'd first had a go with them and was astounded by what they could do. And I remember you saying you were astounded by what they could do, and then talked about the limitations. Might you say a little bit about what a large language model is, its strengths, but also its sort of fundamental simplicity?
Well, we were, I suppose, I mean, this is, again, how history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. I remember talking to one of the eminent AI professors in Edinburgh was Donald Meekie, and he was busy, his Drosophila for AI, the test subject was chess. And he was confidently telling us in the mid-80s that no computer program would ever beat the world's best chess player. Of course, Kasparov succumbed to Deep Blue in 1996. And that was because even when you're in the middle of the subject, the exponential increase in compute power can actually, it can surprise you. A method that would have been entirely implausible, because at the time Donald was trying to build chess-playing programs that emulated the heuristics, the methods that human chess players used. But a system in 1996 that could search 100 to 200 million board positions a second wasn't playing chess like any human, and produced this extraordinary result, which at the time, of course, people saw as presaging the end of humanity, the end of work, the end of...
But was that just essentially speed, that it could go through all those...
It was power, it was brute force and a little insight. And because the systems did understand a lot about the opening games, databases of opening games, closing games. They had patterns that they would play to. There was heuristic weighting, so you could judge certain sorts of moves as being more promising than others. But the sheer capacity to search deep into the game tree, as it's called, your moves against my possible moves, and so on, deep into the game tree, that had not been available until this continuing doubling and redoubling of compute power every 15 months. Now, what happened with the emergence of large language models and allied technologies? A couple of things. One is that continually increasing compute power, the availability of data at planetary scale, so huge amounts of human written text, for example, huge amounts of imagery, and a method that began to exploit other developments, which you often see, which is the engineers and material scientists give us new ways of computing that deliver new opportunities. So the GPUs, the thing that everybody is contesting for at the moment, these chips that NVIDIA make, are particularly suited for certain sorts of operation, fundamentally close to the base of where they compute their logic, that maps very well onto modern styles of machine learning. And in fact, it allows us to take all of those words and re-represent them in this very high dimensional space and literally work out the probabilities of one word following another for the entire corpus of human text it's hosted off the internet or the web, which is a preposterous idea on the one hand, and yet has been realized in systems like ChatGPT. So that the next token prediction method, which these systems embody fundamentally, gives you this eerily coherent connected text back. And when I was first looking at these with a colleague who is now Senior Vice President at Google, James Manika, who was showing me some of the latest models out of Google, we were both similarly a bit unnerved, you know, and the first thing we did was run and find a series of really hard problems it wouldn't solve. So we thought, the All Souls entrance exam of Oxford, you know, and the extraordinary kind of questions you could pose to it, you know, there is no Marx without Lenin, you know, discuss. And that would come this extraordinarily elegant kind of essay, and we're talking some years ago now, and that was a moment when you saw the capacity of these systems to represent what we have committed to our corpus of human understanding in this plausibly coherent way was a new capability.
And it is extraordinary what it can do, but is it fair to say, and I don't mean this in any derogatory sense, it's essentially vastly, vastly sophisticated statistics upon which we anthropomorphize its thinking?
Well, there's this big argument at the moment about whether these systems really reason. People argue about whether we really reason, of course, but they are effectively statistical approximators. And that reveals itself in the mistakes they make, as well as the very coherent output they give you. I mean, a good example of this in the early days is that you could give ChatGPT two large numbers to multiply together, and there's a pretty good chance it would give you the wrong number. Nowadays, it calls up a little Python calculator because it knows that, you know, calculators actually know how to do sums. Statistical approximators that are trained on the content out on the web will get it wrong.
And did it learn that, or was that programmed in?
Well, I mean, this is the question, where in all of the material digested, where did the ability to give you a coherent response, whether it's an arithmetic, whether it's the current tax rates, whatever they are, where was that taken from? The big challenge now, of course, in assessing these systems is, whether they have been trained on the homework we give them in advance of being given the homework or the benchmark. So there's a really interesting, before GPT may become a very significant breakpoint, not least because these systems now are generating a lot of the content on the web as well.
So model autophagy disorder, is that something real, do you think?
Well, this is what a repurposing of MAT, model autophagy disorder, actually beautifully illustrated by a paper that appeared in Nature from some of the authors' colleagues here in Oxford. Because these systems are statistical next most likely token predictors, one thing that will happen under certain conditions is that if they start to be trained increasingly on the output of other models like them, they overestimate likely events and underestimate unlikely events, to the point at which they begin to clip the ends of the distribution, so they tend to regress to the mean. Now that's got interesting consequences for systems that are being trained on synthetic data. Or if you literally give them output, if you like, an essay from one of these systems and feed it as input to the next generation of systems, you've got a whole load of synthetically generated essays. Over time, they become unstable and start to generate, well, essentially, nonsense after hundreds of generations of training.
Just before going on to your new book, I want to bring up a few things that you discussed in your previous book, The Digital Age. And I should say that both your current and previous book is written with Roger Hampson.
I should say,
and it's delightful that Roger is in the front row.
None of these books would have appeared without Roger's extraordinary ability to kind of get me to sit down and think about how to explain clearly to a general audience.
Roger, he's buttering you up to send the hard questions to you, and they can't.
And none of it would have been possible without Bev and Esther, who supported us as we kind of sequestered ourselves away to write these books, I should say, as well. Yes.
So the question, we hear a lot about concerns about new technologies taking jobs and things. And, you know, the argument against that is Luddites have always been wrong in the past, but, you know, perhaps they're right this time. But you've argued quite strongly that there are sectorial issues, but overall we shouldn't be too worried about it. Is that a fair?
No, I mean, I think the 2018 digital age, we kind of, I think we did prefigure quite a few of the issues that have come to the fore. One of them was the destruction of jobs. And there is concern that certain sorts of role will become automated, but the experience has always been, it's not least for the simple mechanics of capitalism. You need somebody earning a wage to buy the products that are being produced by the system. And people say, oh, that could be universal basic income. Actually, it's much more likely to be new jobs we haven't thought of yet, which we give people to do because they're thought to be valuable. Who'd have thought a social influencer would be a valuable concept? Of course, there are many people whose living is entirely premised on that, or a prompt engineer, or people who might have to assure the data that's ingested by these systems, or indeed generate the content, the human content, to keep these systems in some sense actually coherent. So we always find new roles, and often the jobs that we think will be completely disintermediated. I mean, that's not how it seems to operate. People might have said, when Deep Blue beat Kasparov, well, now we have a super achieving chess computer, and in fact, DeepMind's latest chess-playing programs way outperform Deep Blue. Human beings haven't stopped playing chess. They still derive huge pleasure from it, joy from it. Tournaments are held, hybrid tournaments are held with machines and humans. We evolve and innovate to find things that we find meaningful in life, and I believe there will be lots of things that are important in our economic and social lives which will earn a wage.
There's a more subtle concern that, yes, the net number of jobs won't change, but there'll be a hollowing out of the middle. You'll get the very well-paid tech bros and things, and then many people doing things, the caring professions, where arguably be far harder for AI. Does that concern you?
I think that is, in general, the kind of widening separations, the Gini index, however you measure this. This is a real social challenge. But that isn't the same as a world without work.
Yeah.
And again, if we look at the creation of jobs in the last number of decades, the idea that all employment will disappear in a few decades' time, I just don't think we believe that's a reality.
So following quickly on from ChatGPT was concern about existential risks. And we had the letter written by many people, including Elon Musk, saying there should be a moratorium on research and things. And you've been one of the people who've been arguing about we need to, again, if I get it right, worrying far more about some of the known problems today than some of the existential things that are decades down the line.
Well, we need to have an eye on those existential risks, of course. This is a dual-use technology. It's a general-purpose technology. We will doubtless find, and we are finding, ways for it to do us harm as well as good. And unrestrained use of these kind of systems could be very problematic. You don't have to be a large language model. Indeed, this is not a new problem. The idea of putting AIs into highly sensitive command and control situations where the human is out the loop has been exercising us for some considerable time. And we have to be really thoughtful about what the safeguards are in that, and thoughtful about whether we get into this arms race where we literally, because of reaction times, tell ourselves we can't have a human in the loop. And so what are all of the issues around those rules of engagement and so forth? So the existential risk, that type, and there are other kinds. People have reviewed these from the kind of, nothing has to be kind of self-aware out there to be kind of busy consuming all the resources that matter to humans if we're not careful about setting them up right. So there are things that we need to be alert to. I think we've given quite good attention to those, and I think there are efforts underway to attend to them. But it's the imminent issues around issues of justice, issues of privacy, issues of accountability, transparency, the issues we talk about in the book that are really quite urgent right now.
And do you think there's a risk that by concentrating on what might happen, AI robots taking over the world, then we worry about that and it takes our eye off the problems that we have now and the next decade?
Some people say this might even be a form of misdirection. Look over there, not here. Because the here right now is where we are living in a world in which AI-powered recommender algorithms are feeding content to vulnerable members of our population, to children, in a way that is very unregulated at the moment and demands urgent attention.
So let's go on to talk about your new book, which is a fascinating exploration of the morality around AI. And you've called it As If, which when I picked up the book, I couldn't understand why. But when you read the book, then it does what it says on the tin. Could you explain As If as the sort of major metaphor that permeates the whole book?
So the notion is that, and it's been very interesting to talk with colleagues in philosophy, to the serious card-carrying ethicists about this. In some sense, we as human beings, we are moral agents. We live in a world infused by values. We may choose to make particular choices under certain circumstances, but this is something we know about or we're inculcated in. And we might not have philosophized about it or thought about how to frame it or understand it, but we live in a sea of moral estimates and judgments. And the thought was simply that since we are really very well attuned to that, indeed we built legal, social conventions, laws, as I say, forms of civility in society based on some of those views, just take that and move it into the world of AI systems. And that we judge their behavior as if they were human. Not to say that they are sitting there cogitating or self-aware or reflecting on the wickedness that they've just perpetrated, but as if allows us to hold them to standards that we would wish to hold ourselves to.
And very interestingly, you talked before going on to AI about the different systems of moral thought that we as humans have for each other's. And if I understand rightly, you pick one particular as being most appropriate for AI, which is sort of virtues. And then you have a discussion about which virtues are appropriate, not courage, but you want prudence to be, things like that. But there's another way that we humans think about morals, and that's as duties and rules. And although today, in a more secular society, we don't talk about, or much less than we used to, about God-given rules. So I was a bit surprised you didn't think about, you didn't consider God-given rules for AI, given that we are, in a certain sense, the gods and that equivalent.
Well, perhaps they will become, who knows?
Well, true.
No, I think
duties versus
we absolutely promote what we call a mixed philosophy approach. So we don't hold any one of these particular frameworks in ascendancy. In fact, if you look at the history of ethics, Aristotle, of course, put forward a virtue ethics classically, deontological or obligation-oriented, duty-oriented ethics, long tradition coming out of all sorts of different founts of obligation, whether it's to a god, whether it's to other authorities. All the way through to, of course, consequentialism or various forms of utilitarianism, which is often that which is most fashionable in, dare I say, lots of computer scientists' mind, because what you're thinking of there, you're thinking of optimizing for a function. I mean, literally trying to make something optimal across a range of outcomes. And of course, that maps quite nicely onto a notion of the greatest good for the greatest many. And that can sound like a very decent operating principle. When you think the greatest many might include generations yet unborn, you get into another set of arguments there, which is interesting. But what we like to point out is that you can have, and in fact it was one of the great Oxford philosophers who said, we're all climbing the same mountain from different sides, and in some sense trying to understand what the good constitutes. Often it's a trade-off. I mean, the great kind of philosopher Isaiah Berlin from Oxford would often say that, again, to rephrase that classical phrase, how do you deal with the crooked timber of humanity? And often it's because our preferences, our instincts, our morals are often in contradiction, in dissonance with one another. And what we're trying to do here is give ourselves a frame which allows us to assess, in a general case, what we would think to be an appropriate form of engagement with our AI systems. And we think virtues like respect. What does a respectful interface looks like? Well, we can think what a disrespectful one looks like. In fact, people would say that many of our interactions with the online chatbots, social bots that are released on the web, are precisely an version of that. Not to say that people might not prefer those contexts, but to be aware that in many cases we look to promote civility, to promote transparency, to promote friendliness, civility in these systems.
Do we have to be civil back to them? I do swear at chatbots.
Well, you can, but we all go down that route, perhaps. And again, that's an interesting way of thinking about the challenge, which is, again, I think behavioral science has something to teach us. There was a serious argument that in the case of extreme recidivists, wouldn't you rather have them take out and vent their fury on a robot rather than a real human? And there are interesting arguments around saying that actually that's a bad idea because in a certain sense, we are all coarsened by that form of interaction.
Moral contagion, yeah. So a great idea of what we want from our AI systems. But then who is responsible for actually building them in? And I guess I have two questions there. One is, what are the institutional structures that we need to build up such that we get respectful AI systems that act as if they are good humans? And then to put it crudely, where this doesn't work, who do you sue?
Who do you sue? Well, of course, when things go wrong, there are lots of origin points for error. Okay, and this may be a bad training set. It may have been a inappropriate allocation of resource or time. Or computer scientists have always been worrying, of course, in building their systems on whether they can validate and verify how they will behave in particular circumstances. And one of the interesting challenges with our AI systems is that there are modern AI systems. There's a real question about what it means to validate and verify. And then if you find a problem case, how do you trace it back to the origin, its locus? I should say what we're beginning to see emerge in modern AI is a recognition that there will not be one method to rule them all. So there won't be just one machine learning method that we implement in the most capable AI systems. There'll be federated systems comprising different skills and different capabilities. And in some cases, those methods give you very high levels of certainty that if you've described the problem appropriately, you can prove the outcome classes. And of course, in very safety-critical systems, that's what you want. So part of the challenge in designing these systems is to understand what the failure modes might be, what we're prepared to accept by way of error, failure modes, conditions. And that's a conversation you have to have right at the beginning of building and doing the requirements engineering on these systems. I think too often with these general conversational agents, they're built and deployed. Yeah. And they've been tidied up around the edges to remove some of the most egregious ranting that these chatbots can come out with. But in the extreme case, understanding what they are and are not capable of is actually a tough research challenge.
So with the benefit of hindsight, I think this is a quote from you, a dozen white American tech bros who were responsible for making decisions about releasing ChatGPT, and there hasn't been a disaster, but arguably there could have been. Was that the wrong thing to do in hindsight? And what is the lessons for future with new sons of ChatGPT coming through?
Well, to be fair in a certain sense to the platforms, and to all those organizations who worry about these issues. And part of the reason we wrote the book is that there needs to be a conversation around how these systems are deployed and how they're built and how they're regulated. That actually doesn't just involve 12 people on the West Coast. It is a voice, it is a discussion that involves many, many people. Indeed, since we are in a certain sense able to make these judgments, all of us, right, to be engaged in this conversation. And I think if we often use the example of social media, which in many respects, or the web, these systems were built with the best of intentions, often. And they are deployed, and then they are put to a use and have effects that we look at and think, well, there are harms there. We can assess the benefits and the harms. And we should not get into a mode of always assessing the terrible harms. These tools augment us potentially, hugely, and provide us with new ways of doing science, new ways of creating content that are very powerful. But the decisions around and the discussions around what is appropriate, what values we put into them, when we deploy them, should there be sandpits in which these systems are first of all trialed to understand their adequacy and their failure conditions, what they do and don't do well. That is where the whole issue of the regulation and governance of AI is now. It's not, again, not a new thing. We've been thinking about governance in respect to these advanced IT systems for decades. Norbert Wiener in 1947 was writing about the propensity of these computing engines to kind of have huge social effects and impact. But we are now living in an age of mass deployment where, for example, Microsoft's Copilot is in huge numbers of people's computing platforms. So to appreciate what the strengths and the weaknesses of these systems are, what new kind of computational literacy we need, a critical view to bring to these systems is super important. And right now, governments around the world, corporations, and civil society is trying to work through what could the guardrails look like. And indeed, this current government will be thinking about AI regulation into next year and how it deploys it. In the meantime, we've had various gatherings to try and put the high-level guardrails together, and there are conversations going on about what's desirable, and that's all to be welcomed. More importantly, I think it's talking to the people who design and engineer these systems, working with our students here in Oxford, as we do, to teach our computer scientists and other people engineering these systems about the ethical dimensions of their work, the values that are embodied in software, whether it's apparent or not, and to give them that kind of sense of, that sensibility of being a moral agent themselves in developing these systems.
And although we've been sort of talking about some of the issues, some of the problems, certainly the impression I got from reading both of your books is you're far more an optimist than you're a pessimist about what AI. Is that fair?
Yeah, well, you know, Roger had this wonderful phrase, which is kind of partly we're obliged to be optimists because we live in a world where we've benefited hugely from the benefits of the technology and the societies we live in, and we're fortunate to be able to think and reflect on these issues. I mean, the point we make in this book is that we just didn't make our technologies made us. And the point we make there is that you go back 3 million years to flaking those first tools, Australopithecines, you know, that as they got more capable of distant ancestors, their neurology was being refined, their fine motor coordination was being refined, possibly language itself was evolving to enable more effective coordination out of tool building. And we think, in some sense, that our current technology is in some privileged position. No, it has always been entangling itself with us. And when you look at what we've been able to achieve, of course, I think we should be impressed, hopeful, but we should also recognize that those same stone tools that gave us ascendancy over the natural world drove megafauna extinct.
Yeah. And as a biologist, I'm amazed at what deep fold, the protein folding AI system has been able to do. I'm going to ask one final question, then go to the audience, just to warn you on that. And Nigel, the final question I want to ask you is, and you talk about it in the book, but one particular issue, which I know you've been concerned with for 20 years now or more, and this is around privacy. And you, with Tim Berners-Lee, set up the Open Data Institute and things. Might you say well, a little bit about your engagement with privacy over the years and how your thinking has evolved in the new era of large language models and associated technologies?
Yeah, I mean, in fact, working with another the popular books that I've written always seem to be written with somebody else because I think, again, it's great to have somebody who can make you understand how to explain clearly. In 2007, 8, Kieran O'Hara, a colleague at the University of Southampton where I worked, and we wrote this book called The Spy in the Coffee Machine. The Spy in the Coffee Machine literally was meant to be a joke. The fact you can buy off Amazon a internet-connected coffee machine that kind of clocks what you're doing when your workers are using it and use the point of their coffee is kind of, and records their speech is that's the joke. Yeah, well, as they say, life imitates fictional art in this case. The are really interesting questions around privacy because there's kind of a deep paradox at the moment in that we have never, may sound surprising, lived in a more potential for more privacy in a world in which we feel deeply surveyed. Okay. I mean, the privacy guards of the 19th century were essentially, I mean, the Dickensian Jardas and Jardas, it was practical obscurity. It was too hard to kind of track people in a certain sense and scale. Now we feel we're beyond that, but in lots and lots of ways, we've become highly sensitized to the notion of expecting to have a private space and certain sorts of areas of our lives which are for ourselves and of ourselves. We also understand, of course, following the pandemic, that those aren't absolute rights, that your privacy to where you are or what you're doing doesn't necessarily trump the public health interest when you're trying to imagine how you would want to restrict contagion or infection, that there are decisions society will take, and people can contest them and argue them about how you draw that boundary. So we live in an age where privacy, I think, has become a hugely important concept to us. Again, you can go back to the medieval village, and most people would have known exactly what everybody was up to for most of the time, and the notion of having private spaces was really quite challenging for large parts of the population. Our technology is entirely capable of delivering really quite high levels of security and encryption, quite high levels of protection. At the same time, we know that there are societal experiments, literally, in which your behavior is monitored to the extent that people can decide whether you have been an appropriately cooperative citizen or not. So the social credit work that's happening in China and in other places calls to the front of our mind questions about what kind of societies do we wish to live in, and what is this trade-off between our expectations around privacy. And again, privacy, people argue about, is this an essential right? There is this notion in English case law, that common law, that we have a reasonable expectation to privacy. And that reasonable expectation is something that society modulates and changes through time. And one thing we absolutely do believe is that if we care about privacy, we've still got to make the arguments as to why it is an essential part of a society when we want to protect political freedom, integrity, and certain sorts of individual and collective autonomy.
And you talk about sort of interesting, if not solutions, but things that can help with privacy. Might you mention your Solid project with Tim?
Well, that's very, very exciting current work. I mean, Tim's been working on the Solid protocol. Social linked data is what Solid stands for. I mean, Tim gave us the web protocols that brilliantly abstracted over the top of the internet and allowed us to connect a world of information. Solid, and over the time, the 4 years since the web was conceived and then released to the public, 1991, we've seen extraordinary flourishing of the use of the web, and of course, unintended consequences as well. Some of the harms that people now see arising from that, as well as the benefits. We've also seen extraordinary concentrations of power. And in the early days, the web was very highly decentralized. The Solid protocol is about trying to re-decentralize the web, which may sound odd. The idea is that we, all of us, in different ways, and physically in this case, carry supercomputers around with us, have the ability to store and hold data. If that data relates to me, is my health data, well-being data, educational curricula, a whole other range of data, my social habits and preferences, my special photographs that I have. Why does that all have to go to a central depository, which then essentially analyzes it and effectively monetizes it? What if I was to be able to keep control, or at least have an equivalent interest in the data that I've transacted to generate with you, or with a business, or with a government? So solid is about decentralizing the web. It's about putting data literally in your pocket or in your cloudlets or wherever you wish to store it, and the applications come to it rather than it all sitting in a single aggregated place. That decentralization presents challenges, because if you want to do the machine-based pattern reasoning over all their distributed points, how do you do it? How do you do it securely? But it has some very powerful, very interesting properties that we think acts as an interesting counterbalance. And if you think about a lot of architectural settlements, the balance between centralized and decentralized, whether it's energy generation, whether it's in the way we manage our resources, we see this back and forth. And this set of protocols is a way for us to retain much more agency over our data, and potentially, with the services that can be provided of that architecture, to elect what and how we shared, and still get the benefits with it being on our local devices of combined inferences and insights. Because if you bring the app to the data, to everybody's data, you can deliver the insights. They're just not all going to one particular provider.
So, with apologies to people who wanted to ask questions, we have to stop here. But please come upstairs and join us on a glass of wine, and there will be books to sign, and to buy, I should say. And in summing up, I can do no better than to quote the wonderful Jim Al-Khalili of the Life Scientific. And Jim writes, "Nigel Shadbolt is one of the most fascinating and important scientists alive today." And I think Nigel has demonstrated that this afternoon.
Well, thank you.